Please remember, the views expressed on Albertans in Space by our guests and host alike are opinions and do not represent the entire industry as a whole. Our podcast serves only as a platform, and all topics discussed are primarily for educational purposes only. Welcome to Albertans in Space, the series where we talk to Albertans making waves in local and global space industry. In today's episode, we get a history lesson from Marc Boucher as we discuss the history of Albertans and Canadians in space and the current events happening in our sector right now. I'm your host, Zach Trolley.
And I'm the co-host and Space Invader, Megan Westelmajor. Hey, Zach, why did the astronaut get fired?
Well, I don't know.
Oh, he's spacing out at work.
All right. Albertans in Space is filmed in the city of Calgary on Treaty 7 territory. This land, traditionally called Mohkinstsis, belongs to many nations and peoples who make their home here. We honor the traditions taught to us by our elders to acknowledge the generosity of Mother Earth and to take care of our land as humanity expands to new worlds. And speaking of Marcs, did you know that the first Canadian in space was Marc Garneau?
You mean the former Minister of Foreign Affairs?
I do. He was actually a naval officer in the 1970s. Then, in December of 1983, he was selected to be in the first astronaut class, along with Calgarian Robert Thirsk, and the first Canadian female astronaut, Roberta Bondar.
That's so neat. I didn't know you were also a historian.
I am. I Google so many things. Speaking of, Marc Garneau was a payload specialist in the shuttle mission STS-41G on the Challenger shuttle.
What is a payload specialist?
So the term astronaut means you've been to space, kind of like a sailor sails on ships. But that doesn't say much about what you actually do. Astronauts will be given different jobs and tasks on each mission. For example, Chris Hadfield was the commander of the ISS in 2012, meaning he was in charge of the whole station. Before that, he had to work his way up through the ranks to learn all the systems. A payload specialist is a position focused on the operation and deployment of a specific payload for that mission. Marc was in charge of 10 experiments for that first mission.
That's so cool. I had no idea there were so many jobs in the space sector. I guess it's similar to that of the film industry. We have a lot of people that I still don't know what they do. Like, what does a grip do? I'm kidding. I know what a grip does. We are super happy that we'll be speaking with Marc Boucher today. He's got more than 30 years experience in the space news industry, and he'll tell us all about the significance of Canadian space presence and Alberta's as well. How'd you meet Marc?
Marc and I met in Toronto many years ago at a space conference. Since then, I've been a big fan of his journalism in Canadian space. He recently moved to Calgary, and we are so happy to have him on the podcast.
Let's set the stage for our first season and have Marc give us a great sense of where we've come from and what the future holds for us.
Because, spoiler alert, Canada is going to the moon, but before we get to that, why don't you introduce him to our audience?
Marc Boucher is the founder of SpaceQ, a Calgary-based space news and intelligence company. Marc is also the director of digital platforms for space news and has over 25 years of experience in various roles in the global space industry and a total of 30 years as a technology entrepreneur. At a young age, Marc always knew he had a love for space. However, his path towards the industry didn't begin right away. Instead, Marc would pursue internet technologies and entrepreneurship. As a natural innovator and creative, he would go on to become quite the successful founder of various tech companies, including Atera Technologies Corporation, Maple Square, and SpaceRough. His connection to the internet would become a stepping stone towards the space sector. Prior to attending the founding conference of the Mars Society in 1998, Marc volunteered to improve their website. This marked the beginning of his journey into the space industry. And the rest is history.
Let's bring on Marc. Welcome, Marc. You are our first official guest on the first season of Albertans in Space podcast. Thank you so much for coming online with us.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Let's talk about your history first, Marc. When did your passion for space start? When did that spark ignite?
Oh, well, that was at a very young age. There's no doubt about that. I suppose it was just I grew up in Montreal. And if you've ever been in Montreal in the wintertime, it's really cold. We get a lot of snow, but we get these, at least back then, it's probably not as much now, incredibly clear nights. And to see the sky the way you could see it back then, you know, it was easy to recognize constellations. You know, once I started getting, you know, reading some books about, you know, what was I actually looking at, I was just fascinated. And then as a Christmas gift, I think I was 10 years old, I got a telescope. Was it a Meade telescope? I think it was a Meade telescope. And, you know, it wasn't very much by telescope standards. Looking through that telescope, and actually seeing, you know, the stars through the scope, and then figuring out how to look at a planet through the telescope, that just got me started. And like I said, this was in the winter time. So, and considering we had lots of snow, I sort of, since I didn't have an observatory, I would make a snow seat. Okay. And then just, you know, so that I could position myself in the right way to look at a certain object. And I think, you know, I started off with Mars. My telescope wasn't very powerful, but it was still something to see. But I think the one object that I looked at that really just blew my mind was taking a look at Saturn and seeing the rings. And so that just got me started. And then after that, I wound up reading, you know, a variety of different things, including some science fiction. And that just sort of kickstarted my love of space. And I thought, you know, hey, I'm going to be an astronaut. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. Didn't quite work out that way, but I eventually did manage to get into space in a way.
Let's talk about that. How did you, so you had the spark as a kid. How did you transition from, you know, internet entrepreneurship to space entrepreneurship? What was that transition like?
In 1996, I think it was, I read a book called The Case for Mars, written by Robert Zubin and Richard Wagner. And I picked that book because, you know, I was interested in space, but I was also interested in humanity going beyond, because we hadn't gone back to the moon at that point in, you know, 23 years, I think it was. And everybody was talking about, you know, next object is Mars. So I said, okay, I'm going to do some real research on Mars, read the book, and that got me really interested. And so I said, you know what? I did some more research, and I found out there was this new organization called the Mars Society, a nonprofit, group that was trying to galvanize support to get NASA and on board with getting a mission to Mars and getting humans to Mars. So for the first time in my life, I said to myself, I'm going to get involved. So I contacted the Mars Society and I said, you know, you guys are going to be putting on this first conference. I want to go to the first conference. By the way, your website is average. I can make it look better and have it do things that will, garner more interest. And so I sort of took on that role. It also so happens that several months before the conference, which was in the summer of 1998, I had a trip to Asia. And on that trip, one of my stops was in Sri Lanka, where I met with Arthur C. Clarke and actually got him to record a video to present at the first conference of the Mars Society. And so that's how I got from always been a fan, reading, whatnot, and saying, you know what, I have the time, my company's doing okay, I want to get involved, let's try this.
There's not many people that can claim, you know, my transition started with a conversation with Arthur C. Clarke. That's a pretty big leap forward there.
Who is Arthur C. Clarke?
Who was Arthur C. Clarke?
Yeah,
Mark, do you want to field that one?
So I should have said Sir Arthur C. Clarke.
Yes, true.
Ooh, a knight.
So yes, he was knighted. Sir Arthur C. Clarke, one of his biggest passions was actually all things science, but telecommunications, and also, a lot of people don't know this, oceanography. He was one of these thinkers that sort of crossed over from being able to talk about the technology, the science of space, and make it come across so that people could understand it. So he was a very good communicator. And he's the one that posited telecommunication satellites.
I think it was in 1946, if I'm thinking correctly, because he wrote that paper on geosynchronous satellites.
That's right. And then from there, he did a lot of scientific work, if you will, but he also ventured into science fiction. I don't know if you've seen this movie from 1969, and that movie would be?
2001 Space Odyssey.
That is correct. So he became quite famous. And at one point, because he had this incredible love of the ocean, he had ventured to, at the time, called Ceylon, which is, a small country off the southeast tip of India. And he fell in love with it and stayed there for the rest of his life, became an icon in the country. And when I went there in 1998, I was at a stage in my life where I said, if I want to do things, just do it. So it was like, I'm just going to contact Arthur C. Clarke, tell him what we're doing, tell him why I want to come to Sri Lanka to visit with him. And he just was like, fantastic.
So tell us a little bit about how you started SpaceQ and what SpaceQ is all about.
I wanted to create a website that would showcase Canadian news. So we actually, before SpaceQ came to be, we had a small site, which was SpaceRef Canada. Didn't do too much with it, just a little bit. But in 2017, I decided I wanted to really do more with on the Canadian side of it. And so then that's why I created SpaceQ. We have a very dedicated audience. It's not, as media companies go, massive audience, but it's a very dedicated audience, young and old, industry vets, professors, everything in between. And, it's just a joy to do it because it's great to see, especially in the last 10 years, how things have changed in Canada. There's a lot more opportunities, including on the commercial side.
Let's take a step back and kind of go, through the history of Canadian space. So we were the third country in space. A lot of things have happened since then, from then to now. But why do you think that history is important? Why is it important to know that Canadian history?
Well, because it affects Canadian lives every single day. Let's start with that.
Right.
And Canada has always been a big partner in the space science area. Alouette satellite that went up as the third satellite in space was a scientific satellite, and it was doing something that hadn't been done before. And since then, we've done a lot of small instruments, larger instruments, partnered with a lot of countries, in particular the United States. And over that course of that time, we've developed expertise in a variety of areas that are, incredibly important to Canadians' lives, even though they don't think about it, because, it's just, these things that happen, right? And we'll start off with number one, weather. Earth observation is one of the biggest things that we do. And it's important to everybody, not just for your daily weather forecast, the farmers forecast, wildfires, which we can talk about later. And so, Earth observation is a part of that. And then we've, over time, developed expertise in other areas, and countries come to us to partner in those areas, including, obviously, we became experts in robotics with the first Canada arm on the space shuttle. That's led to a follow-on Canada arm on the International Space Station with the suite of robotics, which has now led to the another iteration, Canadarm3, which is going to be on the Gateway, which is sort of like a smaller version of the International Space Station that's going to be at the moon. And so, that's part of it. And now more recently, because this is also important to Canadians, health. Right? A lot of health, different initiatives, but everything that we do in terms of health in space have an application for here on Earth. And then, of course, the other one is telecommunications,
which we're doing right now.
Which is what we're doing right now. And when people stop at Starbucks in the morning or Tim Hortons, right? Those transactions are all going through satellites.
Mm-hmm.
Those four main areas that I've sort of mentioned are things that we've done over the years and gotten better at, and it's incredible.
So cool. What would you say Alberta's place in the Canadian space history is?
Around 2010, there's this shift that came in space, and that is that we were building these satellites that were the size of school buses. right? Very expensive to build those. Long time to get those built. You need big rockets to put them into space, and they were all going to geosynchronous orbit, very far out there. But, in Canada, there was this push to make satellites smaller. Technology had changed. Computer technology had changed. Miniaturization of computers, of sensors. This all led to the satellites getting smaller, and this new notion of creating a small satellite to perform a function. And this started to percolate in the universities. And in Canada at the time, the University of Alberta, for example, they got interested in this. And they created the satellite called Alta-1, I think it was the original one. And it's just a small satellite that did a bunch of Earth observations. But that led to Alta-2. And in 2015, I came up with the idea. At the time, I was also, besides doing space ref, and just before I started SpaceQ, I was also supporting the Canadian Space Commerce Association. And I decided that, it was time to have a larger conference in Canada to talk about small satellites and how Canada can be a part of that. And in particular, I wanted to make sure that there was a track for students. And one of the people that came to the conference was actually from NASA. His name is Alex McDonald. He's now the chief economist for NASA. And he came and he talked about an initiative that was happening in the US where they were getting universities, colleges from every state to build and have a satellite launched in space to energize the youth. So out of that came an initiative in Canada to do the same thing. And so University of Alberta was a part of that. The Alta team, a bunch of the students graduated. This led to a whole bunch of students, not just from University of Alberta, but other students in University of Calgary, so forth, to get into these fields. And now some of these companies, including Wyvern, which has offices in Calgary and Edmonton, they've developed hyperspectral sensors. They are actually doing Earth observation now. They have a bunch of satellites in space. And, it's just an area that's blossoming. And, Albertans are a part of that.
I think that education part is so key. I know like the Mars Society has a rover challenge that some Canadian universities are involved in, and this is at the undergrad level, right? I think that's what's it's mind-boggling to think that, in the 60s it was massive government projects. This was cutting edge. And now you have a group of 20 students that are maybe 22 years old that are building satellites. That is a huge change.
After 2015, the Canadian Space Agency went ahead and did the first CubeSat challenge. They're now into the second one, which is called the CubeSat Initiative in Canada for STEM. It's called CUBIX. And University of Alberta's Alta-3 satellite was one of the satellites that was funded close to $400,000 for measuring ice and snow coverage. And that is going to launch in a few years.
What is the difference between the Canadian Space Agency and, let's say, NASA? What does the Canadian Space Agency actually do?
They're very similar organizations. We'll start with that. Where they're not similar is in the budget size.
Yep.
Because in the US, NASA has always been well funded. As a matter of fact, as a percentage of GDP, it was incredibly funded in the 60s, but that was because they were trying to get to the moon. But so there's a lot of similarities. I mean, they're all there to provide funding, to develop knowledge that's going to help humanity. So the Canadian Space Agency supports space science, right? But it's also there in a much smaller way to support businesses developing technology that are going to be used in space or for space and help the Canadian economy.
I'm curious to know if the CSA and NASA recognize different types of astronauts. Is it the same or is it different?
I would say very much the same because Canadian astronauts actually get some of their training in the US. I mean, that's how they become, they join NASA astronaut classes. I mean, we select our astronauts, then they go through training in Canada, but also they go through regular NASA training. We are at a time where in Canada, especially for a younger generation, that it's never been so good to try and get into a career in space. And it doesn't have to be a technical career or a science career. It can be management, policy. It can be even arts. I mean, media. The Canadian Space Agency and the amount of funding that we actually put in on a year-to-year basis, if you compare it to some of the other, let's say, top 10 countries, we've been falling behind. Even though, there's been a lot of funding in the last few years, funding announcements for big projects, which is great, but these are over long time scale. These are over 10, 15, years or more in some cases. Lots of opportunity. I personally think, and I've said this many times, that we should spend a little bit more because there's a lot more that we can do. There's definitely an incredible opportunity. The CSA provides some really great programs. Just wish they were funded a little bit more.
Can you talk a bit about the iconic Canada arm? It's on the $5 bill. It has a long history from its development.
Well, first of all, it was an experiment. It was, Canada stepping up to the table when the International Space Station was to be built. It was going to be so big that we needed some sort of robotic arm that was going to be placed in different places that could move around to repair something, to move something. And Canada basically came to the table of the international community and said, we can do that. We funded it to and that contribution became our contribution to the International Space Station, which then allocated X number of hours that Canadian astronauts could go to the station and participate. And I'd say what they did back then was a lot harder than what some of the opportunities are available now. It just staggers the mind, all the science and technology that went into that first Canadarm. We were getting all the data back on everything that it was doing in space. This then fed into, okay, how do we improve the technology for the second arm, right? Then you add the fact that computing power has, gone exponential. Parts have been miniaturized. Now we're talking about AI, artificial intelligence, and there is going to be some artificial intelligence on the gateway at the moon. Canada has built an expertise which, other nations out there are trying to replicate, but we still have the lead in that. And as long as we keep doing what we're doing, we're going to keep that lead.
And I think we forget that, as Canadians, right? We, like you said, we put our hand up and said, we can do that. We took that first step, and now we are the global leaders, right? There's the Canada arm is on the space station. It's on the shuttle. It's on going to be the gateway. We're the go-to contractor for that.
And the next thing is that the International Space Station is going to come to an end around 2030. I mean, that's the scheduled time frame, but we still need a space station up there. And so we're moving, at least in for some nations, to once again sort of international collaboration on space station, but being led by the commercial sector, smaller space station. Everything's growing upon what was done in the past. Of course, the next thing is going to be, we need robotics on the moon, right? And we made a decision, the Canadian government made a decision to fund rover technology. That small investment back then has now led to several companies in Canada now getting ready to create rovers that are going to go on the moon.
Yeah.
And of course, in other areas, in particular, sensors for satellites, the opportunities there are off the chart. I mean, if you think about it, we're 2024. I think in 2019, there were less than 1,000 active satellites in space, right?
Right.
And now I've lost track. I think, SpaceX has got what, 3,800 of their own satellites,
Yeah.
for Starlink. And a couple of weeks ago, SpaceX launched a mission, which is part of their transporter series, where they take a lot of small satellites, fit it onto this infrastructure in the shroud of the rocket. And there was 116 payloads, satellites that were launched, and then individually or within groups, some went this way, some went that way. And so there's tons of opportunities out there on the technology side.
That's so great. I am very curious to know about international relations. Many countries have their own space forces now, which I find problematic as well as exciting and interesting. It really opens up the conversation of who owns space and how that's going to come about. That conversation is going to happen once more people are living or working in space. How do you think that international relationships are going to go, and military involvement?
Oh, that's a good question. That's also a very difficult question, which a lot of people think about and write about and discuss. It's one of the couple of conversations that are right at the top right now. So here's the thing. We have the Outer Space Treaty that was signed by, I can't remember the number of countries, a lot of countries in the late 60s. It sort of governs the use of space. In that respect, we do have space policies and some laws that govern what we do in space. Having said that, it doesn't cover everything. And there are areas that are gray, if you will. Military in space is not so much an issue as weapons in space. The militarization of space is definitely an issue. A lot of countries, including Canada and the US, are trying to make sure that it doesn't, there is no war in space.
Right.
No space wars.
Let's avoid that one.
But there are countries that are spending money on how's the best way to take out a satellite, whether it's a communication satellite. And they're working on different ways. They're working on cybersecurity, right? Which is in some respects a lot better than trying to blow it up, if you want to put it that way, where, basically they're trying to disable the satellite. It is happening. It is an issue. Am I super concerned about it? No. And I say that because if you create problems in space, it affects everybody. So you're not doing yourself any favors.
There's a bit of, I guess, mutually assured destruction. If we close out space, everybody loses space.
Everybody loses. Everybody loses. We have become reliant on space. If the telecommunication satellites or the Earth observation satellites stopped working tomorrow, your day-to-day life would become very difficult.
So, Marc, let's take a little look into the future. We mentioned rovers, you mentioned the Gateway, looking at the moon, looking at Mars. What are you excited for in the next coming, let's say, 10 years?
A decision to invest long-term in the moon. The United States has done the same thing. We now have an astronaut in Jeremy Hansen who is going to go to the moon, right? I don't know how long after this podcast comes out that will be. It'll be within a year, maybe 2 years from when this podcast comes out.
We're hoping to book him for season 2.
Yeah.
First Canadian's going to go to the moon. Now, he's not going to land on the moon. He's going on the Artemis 2 mission that's going to go around the moon and go as the furthest that any man capsule has ever been. So the moon, we're investing, and the US and other nations are investing a lot of resources on the moon because we want to, there's obviously the scientific portion of it, but of course it's also a part of exploring, expanding outwards from the Earth. But some of the other things that are happening, which are, to me, are really exciting because it's something I've been wanting to see for a long time. And it's sort of, you think of it as science fiction, but it's now becoming reality, which is spaceports.
Right.
Right? Everybody, when you think about a rocket launching, right? Most people think of, oh, Florida, we're going to launch a rocket, from, Cape Canaveral Kennedy Space Center into space, because that's where majority.
That's where rockets come from.
Exactly. That's where rockets are
Exactly.
born.
Yeah.
Right. But, in the US, we have Vandenberg Air Force Base on the West Coast for launching in different orbits. Then on the East Coast, there's also the spaceport in Virginia. And then you look globally, and you're finding that other countries are wanting to develop spaceports to launch their own rockets. But in Canada, we now, I've advocated for a long time, just because I could see where things are going. We have more satellites that want to launch than we have inventory of rockets to take them into space.
There's a queue.
Right? There's a queue. And there's also a shortage of launch windows, because the places that launch it are getting full, right?
Right. Yeah.
It used to be that, maybe we did 50 launches a year, then maybe 80 launches a year, maybe 100, right? Well, I can't remember now exactly, but I know SpaceX was on track to do over 100 launches this year on its own.
That one company is doing as much as we used to do, the entire world used to do in a year.
Exactly. There have been various efforts over time to develop a Canadian launch vehicle, to try and get a spaceport started. We already have, Cold Lake Air Force Base, right? Who knows? Maybe we could have rockets launching from there someday. But
That is exciting.
yeah, so I mean, there are a lot of young companies in Canada that are trying to develop rocket engines and rockets to try and launch from Canada and elsewhere. And they're just itching, and then they're itching to do it. There's companies that want to launch satellites from Canada. So I see that as another one of those areas where there's incredible opportunity.
Now, Marc, you mentioned Canada investing in medical technology and ensuring there is a trade-off from space here on Earth. What about the opposite direction? Because you mentioned space resources. What about Alberta resource companies offering their services to space? What does that look like?
Yeah, so obviously Canada is a huge mining company with a lot of technology, and I've actually spoken to a few mining companies. And when I first told them what I wanted to talk to them about, and this is the first time I think I started talking to them was like 10 years ago or so, some big companies too, and they were like, "What are we talking about?" There's a lot of synergies between the mining industry, let's say, and what you need to do in space in terms of mining. There's just one company in Alberta, Space Engine Systems. Here's a guy who's in the oil and gas business, and he said, I design and manufacture all sorts of pumps, multi-phase pumps and whatnot for the oil and gas industry. I think I have a passion for space as well. How can some of the technology that we've developed for the oil and gas business translate to building a rocket to go into space? So he's actually focusing on hypersonic technology and these pumps that he had built, right? And then taking it beyond obviously what oil and gas was doing for it, but then reimagining some of the technologies into building this hypersonic engine that will take cargo into space, and eventually he'd like to take humans. People who have worked in traditional industries who are now, in Alberta with its oil and gas, with its mining, whatnot, people in agriculture, right, who are saying, well, how can a satellite help me figure out when to plant this crop and how to monitor the crop?
Being a part of this podcast for me is opening my mind to how amazing it would be if we were to support this type of infrastructure. I want to know more about the Small Sat Symposium. Can you tell us a little bit about the conference?
I came up with the idea. I convinced my colleagues at the time at the Canadian Space Commerce Association around 2015, beginning of 2015, that we wanted to do this. And just like in the 90s, when I said I'm going to go meet Arthur C. Clarke, I just said, let's just do it, right? And, it basically meant calling and talking and emailing a lot of people and including some cold calling, to try and get people to come to this event. And I basically said, look, universities have put on, some conferences like this, but nobody's approached it from the commercial perspective. The synergy of taking what universities are doing and then saying, hey, can we transform this into a business that can then lead to products and technology that can help the Canadian economy? Maybe I got lucky, but I talked to the right people. I got the right people to show up at this conference. And I was adamant that, as part of this symposium, we would have a mini student symposium. The students weren't it wasn't a side part of the conference. It was part of the main conference, right? And so they were able to sit side by side with, hey, that's the president of the Canadian Space Agency. And the Canadian president of the Canadian Space Agency saying, oh, I've heard of your effort. Bring these people together. I don't normally say this, but I think I was proud that it actually happened and worked. And it led to another symposium. It led to companies being formed. And I'm just happy that I and my colleagues who worked together on this were able to put something together because we saw that there was an opportunity and that, it's grown well beyond what we started. The one thing I also want to mention, I know this isn't the Small Satellite Symposium, but there's another competition that happens every year, the Space Apps Challenge.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
This was originally started by NASA. It's grown into this global challenge that happens every fall. It's geared towards students. You don't necessarily have to be in university. You can be in a high school. And basically, it's a hackathon. And they give you these challenges. You have X number of, couple of days to put together an app that's going to do something. 21 cities in Canada, including Alberta. One Canadian company, which actually had developed an app that was basically to aggregate data from NASA satellites and then make it available to people. That was sort of their idea. They actually won the global challenge. They won in Canada. They won the global challenge. And then after they won, they then, took a look at what they were doing and said, okay, how can we turn this into a business application, a business that's going to help the Canadian economy, help businesses around the world? And so they did that. They pivoted away from just NASA, open source data to commercial data from other satellites. And that company is called Skywatch. And based out of the Kitchener-Waterloo area, they've grown exponentially. I don't know how many people work at the company now, but, they are a technology company that doesn't put anything into space, doesn't develop anything for space. They develop algorithms, artificial intelligence, software that takes the data from space and puts it into a product that real estate industry and other groups can then use.
I think it just goes to show how many different opportunities are out there in space. Like we said, it's not just astronauts, it's not just hardware, it's everybody. Marc, we've come to a point. We have a special segment in our podcast, the Alberta in Space podcast book club. You are our first guest to announce our book, so we're get our book club hats on.
Book club.
And we want to know, what your choices are. It can be a book that inspired you. It can be one of your favorites. It can be a new read. What are you bringing for us today?
All right, so let's talk about young people to start with, because this really got me going. Robert Heinlein is a very famous science fiction author. When I was 10 years old, he wrote a book called Tunnel in the Sky, sort of a coming of age book. It's written for juveniles. I read that book and it just fascinated me. I've remembered it ever since. I've read a lot of Robert Heinlein books since then because he was a prolific author. Another early book that has nothing to do with space, but inspired me to look beyond Canada to try and understand the world, was called Cry, the Beloved Country by Alan Paton. And it was published a year before apartheid became the law in South Africa. segregation. And I read it in high school as part of a class curriculum. It opened my eyes to the fact that it's a big world out there. And at the time, we didn't have the communication that we have today. So, sure, if you wanted to read about what was going elsewhere in the world, you'd have to get a newspaper. Hopefully they had coverage of something that was going on there. But it really opened my eyes to Canada was just one small part of the world. And there was a lot out there. Getting back to science fiction then, and of course, one of my favorite authors, Sir Arthur C. Clarke. Maybe it's because I met him and we had I remember when I first met him, and we stayed friends until, he passed away. When I first met him, it was just incredible because we had been talking about space elevators because I was interested in Mars, but I'd read one of his books called The Fountains of Paradise. And it had to do with, this space elevator. And it was like, that is just a crazy idea. You build this, basically an elevator to geosynchronous orbit, and you move cargo and people back and forth, right?
Is that even possible? Would that be possible?
It is.
Technically, yes.
That's incredible.
It is possible. The Fountains of Paradise was one of those books that just blew my mind, because it had history. Because he was living in Sri Lanka, then called Ceylon. He mixed real history from the island with this science fiction theme and with this idea for that. And then the other book that just blew me away was Rendezvous with Rama. It's basically about this object that comes into the solar system. First, it's like, whoa, what is that? Interesting. And then it slows down, right? And it's like, oh, that is not a planetary object. That was built by somebody else. A few years ago, we had an object that came across, that came into our solar system. It was this object, which they think is, I think it was a remnant of a comet. They didn't know what it was because it came in a trajectory that it was like, it's from the outside the solar system. It came from somewhere else. To me, that book, and there were some follow-on books were just incredible. And then the last book that I'll mention, which has nothing to do with space as well, is The Path Between the Seas. This is the creation of the Panama Canal between 1870 and 1914. It's written by the historian David McCullough. I actually have the hardcover version of it. And I also have the hardcover of the Fountains of Paradise, among other books. When you look at some of the massive scale projects that we've built on Earth, the Panama Canal is just an incredible project that came to fruition. And it's both an incredible achievement, but it came at an incredible price. Thousands of people, lost their lives trying to build this. Fortunes were lost. History of it is just incredible. How the United States became involved in it. It's a book I highly recommend to understand international effort, the magnitude of the project, and what humans can do when they put their minds to it. So those are I've read, I don't know how many books, but you told me, come up with a book, and it's like, no way.
Not just one book. We've got 5 books.
Yeah, and I could come up with more, but those are 5 that I thought I would mention.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. I feel like we could sit here and talk to you for literally the entire day. Thank you so much for being a part of the first season of Albertans in Space. We might call you next season to discuss more because we've just opened that first page. We've just read the first chapter.
Yeah.
Well, it's been my pleasure. I wish you great success, and I look forward to listening to the podcast and seeing who your other guests are.
We would like to thank Marc Boucher for joining us today. I think it speaks to how taking the road less traveled is the path to get to where you really want to go. It's quite revolutionary, and Albertans can benefit from that same philosophy as far as diversifying our economy.
If you'd like to keep up to date on facts based in Canada and the global space news, check out spaceq.ca.
Shout out to Sandra Lynn for her writing research efforts, James, our sound engineer, 6 Degrees Music and Sound, Dan, our DOP camera, and Kristen, our behind-the-scenes photographer, for helping us make this podcast sound and look amazing. On the next episode of Albertans in Space, we speak with Chris Robson, CEO and co-founder of Wyvern, as he explains to us what Earth observation is, how it benefits humanity, and how Wyvern's innovative aerospace technology has helped put Alberta on the map in the global space industry.
Thank you for watching Albertans in Space. We hope you enjoyed the show today. Albertans in Space is available to watch on Optik TV and through our YouTube channel. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons. We appreciate your support. Follow us on Instagram at AlbertansInSpace_podcast. And that's it for today.
See you next time.